Please welcome Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper.
Please be seated. That's as close as I get to being a minister or a priest or a rabbi. Welcome to tonight's discussion, Crisis and Clarity in the Middle East. It's certainly no secret our global community faces unprecedented, constantly evolving threats. We must move ever faster and adjust and respond to circumstances as they develop. And I think tonight's forum is an example of the type of efforts we've got to make. And I think we should all recognize that this is more critical for all of us, for our community, than ever. The cell has provided a foundation for many years to educate our community on a variety of national threats, on many of the nation's security challenges, has been able to bring in some of the real thought leaders, not just in this country, but in the world, and some of our closest partners. We're very, very proud of Colorado's connection with Jordan. Our National Guard State Partnership Program, it's almost like big brother, little brother. I'm not sure. I think they might be our big brother. But we are brothers. We might, in a funny way, be some form of twin brothers, as different as the two countries may be. For 14 years, soldiers and airmen and women of the National Guard have engaged with their counterparts in Jordan. And in terms of aviation training, disaster preparedness, crisis management, human resource development, we have seen a real family feeling develop between our men and women in the National Guard and their Jordanian counterparts. Last year, the Royal Jordanian Air Force received 12 Blackhawks. The Colorado Army National Guard hosted a team from the Royal Jordanian Air Force at Buckley. And we went to great efforts to make sure that they felt welcomed and they understood how much we valued the relationship, and they realized that their security is another facet of our security. There's a common language of aircraft manuals and tactics and procedures that helps bridge barriers of both language and culture. And they've been able to form stronger bonds and I think more importantly, strategic relationships, so that those relationships carry out into the culture and the thoughts of Jordan and Colorado, and hopefully by osmosis, the United States. Certainly, the success of Jordan and the creation of a secure and stable region in the Middle East is of great value to any American. So we want to welcome tonight all the publicly elected officials who have joined us tonight, the representatives from military, law enforcement, fire, EMS. We know there are a number of you out there tonight. We appreciate your service more than words can express. Let's all of us make sure that we honor their commitment and the sacrifices they make in protecting our community and our country. Thank you. Thank each and every one of you for your service. Now, please also join me in welcoming the person who really created the vision for the cell and recognized that an institution like the cell could play such a critical role in the safety of our state. Please welcome Larry Feisal.
Thank you, Governor. Tonight, we will hear from some of the foremost experts who will be discussing Middle East evolving security landscape. We will learn about shifting roles of regional and world powers in ensuring stability in managing crisis. Our panel will address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, how the regional balance of power is being impacted by potentially nuclear-armed Iran, the crisis in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and how they continue to generate grave political and humanitarian consequences, and the rise of non-state actors and extremist groups who present complex security and policy challenges which increasingly transcend national boundaries. The cell hosts these global security forums to educate you on the most pressing, challenging, and the impact of our national security. And we want to thank those who are instrumental in bringing these educational events to our community. A very special thanks to Governor Hickenlooper for hosting tonight's and many of the other cell events, to the Denver Post, especially Dean Singleton, chairman of the board, and to our other lead sponsors, Steve Ellman, Branded Cities, American Furniture Warehouse, and the SCFD. I also want to thank my daughter Courtney for her vision and dedication in helping develop the cell, my son Cheston, who is making a tremendous impact in our community, my chief of staff Laura Teal, for all that you do. These events would not be possible without many individuals, including Melanie Perlman, the cell's executive director. Tom Ruppel and Jordan Clark, assistant directors. Your staff, along with our volunteers, have done a tremendous job. The cell is part of the Feisal Institute. Funds raised from our annual dinner help us bring this vital forum like tonight's event to the public. We're honored to have a very special individual whose contributions to the state of Colorado are extraordinary, John Eichard. We hope you can join us by paying tribute to him and to support the important work of the cell. Let's take a minute to hear the cell's impact and why we would be delighted if you would join us Wednesday, May 23rd. The screens, please.
For over 30 years, the Feisal Institute has provided unique and powerful programming to develop a more educated, conscientious, and empowered community. This mission is achieved through the work of its two distinct centers, the Counterterrorism Education Learning Lab, the CEL, and the Feisal Museum. One of the greatest challenges to global security today is the threat of terrorism.
You have to go back to September 10th, 2001. The euphoria turned to horror the next morning. The Twin Towers and the World Trade Center had been attacked.
The CEL is confronting this threat through our renowned event series, national training initiatives, and world-class exhibit.
The effect of these speaking series on the community has been nothing less than phenomenal.
The CEL brings some of the most eminent practitioners and thinkers on national security and counterterrorism to Denver.
To answer questions face to face
Whether you consider yourself left, right, centrist, it doesn't matter. Everybody comes together.
The Community Awareness Program was developed in partnership with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and our public safety community.
The CAP was designed to educate citizens in exactly what suspicious activity was and who to report that activity to.
We first heard about the cell right after the unfortunate Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida. So Homeland Security recommended that we access the services of the cell.
The CAP is now the national standard for training citizens by law enforcement, which brings in the community policing concepts which help everyone in the fight against terrorism.
The threat of our time is here. It's on our doorstep right now. Every teacher that I talk to, I ask the same questions. What are you willing to do if it's your given day? You need to have a mindset that you're the emergency manager of your school, of your classroom. You're the first responder. No more not here, not now. That is a mindset that we have to develop. And I think that's part of what the CAP is all about.
Today, this nationally recognized program has been implemented in multiple states and several national sporting events, including the Major League Baseball All-Star Game, Indy 500, Super Bowl, and FIS World Alpine Ski Championships. The Cell Exhibit and Training Center was developed by world-renowned experts and award-winning artists.
I would tell other educators who are considering bringing their classes to the exhibit that it's not really a choice. It's something that they have to do. It is a learning experience for students like no other. It is hands-on, it is engaging, and it come out feeling more empowered to be able to make a difference in our community.
The Cell started partnering with the Boy Scouts of America, and we have thousands of scouts through the exhibit every year.
I have taken citizenship in the nation and also emergency preparedness.
Scouts love that they're interactive, there's hands-on.
I learned how to carry an unconscious or injured person.
What's more important than training and educating this generation to be better prepared for tomorrow?
The Cell is vigilant in informing our community why terrorism exists.
The Cell is unique in its mission, bringing together people from across the globe to exchange ideas. I don't know of any other place, any other event which does that, and that's why we continue to support it.
Once again, please welcome Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper.
So I get the honor of introducing our global security experts, and I don't think, and I've been to Davos, I've been to the Aspen Institute, I'm not sure I've seen three better perspectives on the Middle East than you're going to have tonight. And if I was going to do a full, honest introduction, we would be here all night without getting to hear their own voices. But here is a brief overview. And it is a wonderful honor to welcome back to Colorado His Royal Highness, Prince Feisal ibn Al-Hussein. He's an advisor to His Majesty King Abdullah. He is chairman of the National Policy Council of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. He holds the rank of lieutenant colonel. In 2004, he was appointed as special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Jordan Armed Forces Arab Army. He's chairman of the Higher Organizational Committee of the Special Operation Forces Exhibition, and he's founder and chairman of Generations for Peace organization. So please give another warm welcome to His Royal Highness Prince Feisal ibn Al-Hussein. And then to His Royal Highness's left is Ambassador Dennis Ross. Dennis Ross served as Middle East advisor to 5 U.S. presidents. He was instrumental in assisting Israelis and Palestinians to reach the 1995 interim agreement, successfully brokered the 1997 Hebron Accord, facilitated the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty. He is presently the William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He served 2 years as Special Assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for Central Region. In addition, he was also Special Advisor to Secretary of State Clinton, and we could not be more honored to have Ambassador Ross with us tonight. Really one of the great diplomats in America. And then closest to me is Catherine Herridge. She is the award-winning, and I didn't know they had a title like this, but award-winning Chief Intelligence Correspondent for Fox News Channel. She covers intelligence, the Justice Department, Department of Homeland Security for Fox. She has reported from Afghanistan, Iraq, Qatar, Israel, and Guantanamo Bay. And her recent book, while it is nonfiction, reads, and I've not read the whole thing, but I did get it and I've read part of it, it reads more like fiction. It's called The Next Wave, On the Hunt for Al-Qaeda's American Recruits. And I think it exposes, in an almost visceral way, the new face of terrorism and predicts the source of future threats in the Middle East and North Africa. So with that, I will, please give Ms. Harridge a hand. I almost denied her ovation. Of that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Catherine Herridge. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you all for the tremendous and warm welcome. It's really an honor to be here in Colorado. I just want to recognize the governor and CEL and Prince Feisal and Ambassador Dennis Ross for allowing me to work with you and to be part of the conversation today. Really tonight on the stage with me, we have two exceptional individuals who can help us navigate the shifting geopolitical landscape in the Middle East and what it's going to mean for the United States, what it will mean for the nation of Jordan, what it will mean for this very important and vital strategic partnership in the Middle East, and all happening on a day of dramatic change in Washington, D.C., which will certainly impact the process going forward. Ambassador Ross, please begin by giving us an overview of crisis and clarity as it stands today in the Middle East.
You know, that's a daunting question. Oftentimes when I come out and I speak about the Middle East, I say there's just so little to talk about. You know, we were talking about this before, I have worked in this area for the last 30 years, and I can say, and this is a very big statement to make, this is a region that has been characterized by conflict for a very long time. We've had 4 Arab-Israeli wars. We had Israel fighting Hezbollah and Hamas after those 4 wars. We had an Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s that cost probably about 1 million lives. And I would say all that pales compared to what we see in the region today. The character of the conflict, the scope of the conflict, the lack of limitations within these conflicts. You look at Yemen, which is basically a proxy conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Here we have 2 million kids right now who are suffering from malnutrition in a country that even before this conflict was impoverished, ran the risk of being the first country on the planet to run out of water. If that was the only conflict we were looking at, we would say this is daunting and terrible. But it doesn't compare to what's going on in Syria, which began as a proxy conflict and is much more than that now, and we can get more into that later. But in Syria, you're talking about more than 500,000 dead out of a population of 23 million who made up Syria at the beginning of this war. About 11 to 12 million people are displaced. 5 million outside of Syria, the remainder in Syria, living in conditions that are hard to imagine. A whole next generation of kids, in a sense, being traumatized by what they're living through. A crazy quilt of who's fighting whom in Syria. Okay, if it was Syria, if that was the only other problem, you'd say that is as bad a problem as we have faced in the region. But it's not the only one. Go to the Sinai, and basically Egypt is fighting an insurgency with an offshoot of ISIS. Go to Libya. You have 2 different governments, multiple militias, a country that, given its small population and oil, could have been able to make it and is consumed by conflict. We have an Iran right now that is on the march in the sense that it's using Shia militias from as far away as Afghanistan and Pakistan as a kind of proxy force, almost as an Iranian Foreign Legion, There's at least 20,000 of them that are in Syria. We can talk about Iraq still being a country that may not be facing ISIS quite the same way, but sorting out what is going to be the future of Iraq, especially good with the Shia militias that are financed by the Iranians and the Quds forces, is going to affect fundamentally, I think, what the makeup of Iraq will be. And I haven't even mentioned the issue that I'm most well known for, which is working on the Arab-Israeli, Israeli-Palestinian issue. And that's a conflict that obviously hasn't gone away, and yet it seems almost dwarfed by everything else that's going on. So the challenge in the Middle East today is first to understand what are the most immediate threats that we have to contend with, and how do we then shore up our friends, Jordan being front and center. You know, I didn't mention Jordan in terms of all the conflicts, and yet Jordan has been this sanctuary for everybody who has to run away from a conflict. You go through all the different wars that have taken place in the Middle East, and Jordan ends up being the place where refugees go. I went to the Satari refugee camp for Syrians, fourth largest city in Jordan right now. I know what the UN says about the number of Syrian refugees who are registered in Jordan. They say about 740,000. I know the real number is closer to 1.2 to 1.3 million. So the burden that imposes on Jordan is itself extraordinary. So here's a kind of overview of what we're contending with. As I said, there's very little to talk about.
Prince Feisal, do you share the ambassador's view of the situation, and what would you identify as the immediate threats?
Well, I'll start off by giving you the good news, if there is any good news. No, I think the Middle East is undergoing unprecedented change, and it is very much under challenge, whether we look at the conflicts that are happening within the region. We're looking at the displaced refugee issues. I mean, Jordan, for its part, we believe about 1.4 million Syrians living in Jordan, out of a population of 9.5 million, to give you an idea of how large that is as a burden it is. And the international community does help, but only about 35% of the costs are covered by the international community. The rest is covered by Jordan. And as a result of that, we've faced economic problems. We've got an IMF program, austerity, never a popular thing anywhere in the world. But it's all come out of, directly or indirectly, of the results of almost a disintegration of the traditional Arab states that you had within the region. And there is no, when you're looking at Syria in particular, and I think the ambassador would agree with me, there's no simple solution there. When I was asked in the past, it's like, well, you didn't spend much time talking about the Arab-Israeli. I said, the Arab-Israeli, we basically know what needs to be done. It's not rocket science. Everybody has studied it and come up with the same conclusion. And that is looking at a two-state solution as being the only viable solution out there. So we know what needs to be done. It needs the political will to see it through, both from the Israelis and from the Palestinians. Syria, on the other hand, is a far more complicated solution, where you've got a number of outside elements. I mean, it's ironic when you're looking at trying to find solutions in Syria, where you've got Turkey, Iran, and Russia, all non-Arab countries that are trying to find a solution for an Arab country. So I think there are a lot of challenges out there. It is not getting any easier, but I think we all believe that we have made some progress. Daesh militarily might have been suppressed, but if we're not careful about building on that and building hope, and I think that's the key issue, is building hope within the Middle East, then these extremists will reappear in a new version. It used to be Al-Qaeda, it then became what we call Daesh or ISIS or ISIL, depending on where you come from. They're going to come out with a 2.0 if we keep things the way it is. So I think we all need to work together, and I think that's the strength of the relationship between Jordan and the United States, is we want to see peace, we want to see stability, and we work together to try and achieve that. Is it going to be easy? No, but nothing good ever came easy, and I think working hard and working together and being honest with each other, I think hopefully we can make the world a better place.
This really underscores the importance of the Jordanian-U.S. military and strategic partnership in the region. What could the U.S. be doing to help your country that it's not doing today?
To be honest, the U.S. is doing a lot. It has been a very steadfast supporter of Jordan. The new MOU that's been agreed to will provide us with a stable support from the United States for the next 5 years. That helps us in planning and developing for our economy and also with the military. But I think the relationship, the United States is our #1 donor in terms of support. The United States has been outstanding in standing beside us. And when I travel, people come up and say, thank you for what you're doing. And I answer them, I said, in total honesty and sincerity, we couldn't be doing half the stuff that we're doing had the United States not helped us. And so, I'd like to thank all of you for your support, because it allows us to do the tough things. And I think that's the strength of the relationship. I mean, that's the honesty that we have and the strength of the friendship. And to all my Colorado Guard friends here, it's been a relationship that's almost 15 years old. It actually started even before the partnership. And it really is a brotherhood. It is a sense of belonging, of working together. We have common values, common principles, and we will stand side by side to try and make the world a better place.
Ambassador Ross, President Trump announced today that CIA Director Mike Pompeo will now be Secretary of State, and that the new CIA Director will be a woman for the first time if she's confirmed, Gina Haspel. What's your reaction, and does this change in the leadership at the State Department have an impact on the process?
It's a...
I could ask the question again.
You could. I was asked, I was doing an interview 2 weeks ago, and I was asked to predict something that President Trump was going to do in the Middle East, and I said, I lack humility when it comes to predicting what's going to happen in the Middle East. I have an enormous amount of humility when it comes to predicting President Trump. Having said that, there's no question that Secretary of State Tillerson approached the State Department in a way that didn't allow him to take full advantage of the resources that were there. Now, that's an artful way of saying that in a lot of ways he didn't seem to fully appreciate that he had an institution with a lot of expertise. And that expertise would have allowed him to be more effective on the world stage. To be fair to him, it's hard to be seen as the representative of the United States if you're not seen as speaking for the United States. And if the President is going to tweet in a way that is inconsistent with messages that the Secretary of State is trying to convey, that's going to remain true even with a Secretary of State who is, I think, ideologically and even personally closer to the President than Secretary Tillerson was. So I think one thing that I think Director Pompeo did in the CIA is he helped to restore some of the morale there. And I think he ran the agency in a way that created a sense that the agency was able to operate and fulfill the mission that it had. The fact that his deputy is now going to be, and who is a career CIA, someone who spent her career in the CIA, including coming out of the operations branch, which is unusual. I think that too sends a message to the agency that he is someone who takes an approach to the department that he heads that is very mindful of the mission and includes people from within the agency in fulfilling it. Now, that message to the State Department would be a very welcome message. And it may make the State Department, may improve the morale there, may allow the State Department to play a more effective role. But again, he's not the president. And the president can create a context that makes him more effective or can create a context that makes him less effective. And one thing that I just came back from the Middle East, and I was in Saudi Arabia and Israel, and I have to say that the messages I got, what I heard, were very similar. One of the questions I was getting is, what's the American policy? Now, when people are asking what's the American policy, it means they don't quite know where we're coming from. They don't quite know if they can count on us. And the challenge for the new Secretary of State is to be able to articulate a policy, to convey that policy, and to build a level of confidence about what the direction of the United States is going to be. For him to be able to do that, the president's going to have to make it easier for him to do that.
Prince Feisal, have you worked with Director Pompeo? What are your thoughts on the change?
To be honest, I've met him once or twice when he was in Congress. I have not met him when he moved to the CIA. From what I know, he seems to be a very competent person who understands the region well. So I think he'll do very well in his current position, or his new position if he's confirmed. It's always useful when you've got people that are familiar with the region to help, because you're not having to educate them from scratch. And I think he knows and understands the region well. So I think it's in that sense, we're not worried about him being Secretary of State.
And if there is one thing you could hear from the new Secretary of State that would give you a comfort or a sense that now it will move in a more positive direction, what would it be?
I can't say that the relationship is so long and historically so deep that he doesn't have to say. I think we understand what we're trying to do and how to work together. Whether he's been most recently in the CIA, he understands some of the challenges we face, and particularly with the challenge of combating Daesh or ISIS and the threats that we have. So I think he's well placed to understand, and is a type of person that could land with, on his feet and go run straight off. He doesn't need the time to begin to understand the challenges that we're facing in the region here. I think he's more than aware of that.
It wasn't that long ago that, before the Arab Spring and the rise of ISIS or Daesh, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was really the single greatest grievance that contributed to instability in the Middle East. Ambassador Ross, where are we today?
Well, again, it's a simple question, not necessarily an easy one to answer simply, but let me answer it from, I guess, the following perspective. In all the years I've been working on this issue, I don't think I've ever seen a point where between the Israelis and the Palestinians the gap is wider, psychologically, even substantively. The level of disbelief, it's not distrust, it's disbelief on the part of both publics is so great that that's not normally a context in which you would think the prospect of offering a big plan would be likely to be successful. Now, the administration has been talking about presenting a peace plan for some time. We heard before, or at least earlier, that maybe before the end of last year, then in January, the president did make the decision to declare that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, although he did say at the same time that he was not recognizing specific boundaries of Israeli sovereignty because those needed to be negotiated. That clearly put the Palestinians in a position where they felt they had to make a tough statement in response. I know that Abu Mazen, in effect, was trying to show his own public that was angry that he could be the one who embodied the anger. Jordan and other countries were much more temperate in what they said, and they're still saying, and obviously I won't speak for you, you'll speak for yourself, but they've said, let's wait and see what the plan is. The challenge at this point, having done the declaration on Jerusalem, the plan will have to be more specific than it might have been otherwise. To give you an example of what I mean, it might have been enough before to say 2 capitals for 2 states in Jerusalem. Now I suspect that it probably has to be more specific in terms of what that actually means. Will the plan have something like that? What will the plan say about borders? Those who are preparing the plan are making it clear that they're serious about this, and I know they've reached out to me, they've asked questions. I don't know what's in it, but I can judge from the kinds of questions that this is a serious effort to present what would be a comprehensive plan. Now, if the comprehensive plan is one that is prepared in advance, I don't just mean that they put it all together. I mean that here, if this is to have any chance at all, the administration needs to come to Jordan, it needs to come to the Saudis, it needs to come to the Egyptians, it needs to go to the Emiratis and the Moroccans and work out with them in advance, just as it does with the Israelis, what is a script in terms of what the response is going to be to what is being presented. If you work that through and you go over enough of the plan, then you'll have the potential for an understanding. And if, in fact, and this is one new development, I will say. I mean, I focus principally on the negative issues in the region. The fact is, there is a common sense of threat in the region, at least between the Sunni Arab leaders and the Israelis as it relates to threats like, for example, the Iranians, or for that matter, ISIS or Daesh. And so that sense of commonality creates the potential for the Arab states to play a different role. In the past, basically, we tried to work this with the Israelis and Palestinians without the kind of Arab state involvement that would have been meaningful. Bringing the Arab states into this is necessary for the Palestinians because the Palestinians on their own can't make a decision. They can't. They believe that they're the weakest player. They're divided as it is between the West Bank and Gaza. They see themselves as being the victim of a great injustice, and they don't think they should have to make any concessions. So they need an Arab cover if they're going to be able to make decisions. The Israelis also need an Arab cover because the disbelief of the Palestinians in Israel is so great that any concession made to the Palestinians in Israel is perceived as basically being something that you'll give something and you'll get nothing in return. What they need to be able to rationalize concessions to the Palestinians is, in fact, the unmistakable relationship, public, normal relationships with the rest of the Arab world. So there is a role for the Arabs to play that hasn't been the case before. There is the potential for it, given the interest in solving this problem, because you don't need this problem as well as everything else. And that creates the potential, if the administration can come and prepare the ground before they unveil the plan. My big fear is that the ground won't be prepared, the plan will be presented in a way that produces a rejection, and rather than improving the situation, we'll be worse off afterwards. That can't be the outcome of a presentation of a peace plan.
Yes, please.
If you allow me, I'd add that, as I said, what had been offered is the Arab Peace Initiative. There was a decision taken in a summit in Beirut, was to basically say that if the Palestinians and Israelis manage to find a solution that is acceptable to both, based on the 67 borders, without defining that it had to be fixed. But if the Israelis can make peace with the Palestinians, it will be making peace with the rest of the Arab world. And on top of that, the Islamic organization, the Organization of Islamic States, reaffirmed their commitment, including Iran, to that commitment. So the opportunity, I think, that is a big carrot for the Israelis is that if they can make that step, it means normalization with the rest of the Arab and Islamic world. And I think that is something that has been on the table for a while. Whether that could be used to reinvigorate the process, I think the challenge right now is, as the ambassador said, we're hearing that there is going to be a proposal that's put out there. And I think we're waiting to see what happens and whether that proposal is really something that can lead to a final solution or not. And we're all hopeful that it will. Because like I said in the beginning, what we really need right now is hope in the region. It's sad that when you look at Jerusalem, it can be such a derisive and emotional context. For Jews, for Christians, for Muslims, it's a holy city. And I'd love to see the day, and my father worked very hard all his life for that, as does His Majesty. We'd love to see the day where Jerusalem becomes the beacon of hope for the whole of the Middle East. And that's something that we, are committed to try and achieve. But in the absence of understanding what that plan is, I think for a lot of people in the region, it is a wait and see. We had been told that recognition of the embassy was part of it, but wait till the plan comes out. This is something that you'll be happy with. I think we're still waiting to see that, and I hope it is comprehensive. I hope it is well thought out and really has a chance to succeed, because this, at the heart, is the core issue that we have within the region. And if we can find a fair, just solution to it, and it won't be 100% what the Israelis want, it won't be 100% what the Palestinians want, but this is compromise, and we need to work together for the bigger picture. And I think that's important to keep re-emphasizing. But this will take a lot of the sense of injustice, a lot of the anger away from people within the region who a lot of these extremist elements are using as a recruiting tool. So I think it will be a beacon of hope, not just for Israelis and for Palestinians. And let's be honest, too much blood has been shed. And are we just going to sit back and watch more bloodshed continue and just sit there and say, well, we've got other things to worry about? It's a tragedy. And it's still, to this day, almost 70 years of that conflict, and we are not closer to finding a solution. And I think we really do need to work together in order to find a solution.
Has the President's declaration created challenges for Jordan? Has it created the impression, which I think we can agree has been so vital to the process, that the U.S. is a neutral player? Has it created a perception that the U.S. has in effect taken a side?
What I would say is you've got to differentiate the man in the streets view. We talked about it earlier. When he reads his newspaper, what is the headline?
Headline is that the U.S. recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
He doesn't, that's about as far he's going to read before he's going to react. So a lot of people don't understand that, as the ambassador said, it's not precluding a solution to Jerusalem or prejudicing a solution to Jerusalem. That will be negotiated between both sides. But somebody reads that as a headline, they automatically assume that the United States was going to play the role of an honest broker, and it seemed in that statement to have taken a side. And that's why I think there is a lot of anger, there was a lot of concern that, by doing that, you've effectively, killed the peace process. And that's because people didn't understand also that there was proposal coming out later that would work. So there was a lot of anger to that reaction. And you saw it even displayed all the way in the United Nations. And it's not because people want to tell the United States what it should do, but it has the perception, and perception is sometimes far more important than the reality. The perception is the United States has shifted position to support Israel. And so how can it be an honest broker and really care about the Palestinians and their interests if it's already taken aside? And I think that's the damage that was done. But I think let's look at what this plan is. And if this is a fair and just solution, then I think people will sit there and say, okay, let's give it a chance.
Ambassador Ross, I have a delicate question and a political question. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is knee-deep in a number of corruption investigations. He denies the allegations, but how do his political future impact the process?
Let me just add one more comment on Jerusalem, and then I'll address that.
Of course.
You know, I had no problem with the declaration that the president made. I had a problem with how it was done and the lack of preparation for it. And it relates to what I was saying earlier about the plan. There are things you can do that actually ultimately are right. You know, will a significant part of Jerusalem always be Israel's capital? Yeah. Is it a bad idea to get everybody used to that idea? No. But the point is, prepare the ground, especially with your partners, your Arab partners, who you want to create a kind of special role in this process. Don't deny them their political space. A lot of work could have been done in advance quietly. We could have worked out how this was going to be framed publicly, which would have allowed the president to do what he did, but also at the same time create a context for many of those who have to be a partner in this process. Now, how does Prime Minister Netanyahu's current situation with multiple investigations, on two cases, the Israeli police recommending indictment, the Israeli Attorney General is the one who makes a decision whether or not to indict, and recommendations are not a guarantee that the decision to indict will be made. For the time being, what it certainly does is it builds the weight within his coalition of those who are less flexible on the peace issue. How's that for a diplomatic statement?
That's very good.
You know, there was a lot of speculation in the last few days that he might want to go for early elections. Because to some extent there's been, if you look at some of the polling in Israel after the announcements of the number of state witnesses that the police now have in these different cases against him, some of the polling seemed to show some sympathy for the prime minister in response to what was going on. I don't know whether there'll be early elections or not. And I think it may well relate to the timing of the administration coming with their peace plan. Because I could also envision a circumstance where the administration comes with the plan, it has elements in it that are very favorable from an Israeli standpoint, and maybe some in it that are not so favorable. And the prime minister could decide that this would be a good basis on which to go to an election. In a sense, the plan becomes something on which you decide to hold a referendum. And he could decide, depending upon how he defines his needs, he could define this is the moment to actually move for an early election, because no matter how you slice it, there's going to be something in that plan, just quoting what Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt said to the Security Council. They said the Arabs and Israelis are going to love some of what's in the plan, and they're going to hate some of what's in the plan. And obviously what will determine how the plan does is if there's sort of equal amounts on each side of love and hate. I mean, if it's 85% love on one side and 15% love on the other side, well, it's probably not going to survive. But if there is a plan where basically it is really seen as addressing the fundamental needs of each side, which ultimately, all the talk about, I will say this, because I used to hear this when I was our negotiator, the Americans aren't an honest broker. You know, it's not a new mantra to hear. Maybe it has a new energy now, but the fact is it's not a new mantra. The truth is What the United States needs to be is an effective broker. You cannot be an effective broker if you take the needs of only one side into account. If you take the needs of one side into account, there's no agreement. So you have to identify and address the needs of both sides. If the plan they come with, the ground is prepared for it, and it genuinely does address the needs of both sides, even the Palestinians today who are saying, can't work with the United States, it disqualified itself as being the only broker, the combination of having a plan that actually addresses the national aspirations of the Palestinians and saying, no, we're not going to do that, I think the reality is the combination with the Arab states saying, this is a legitimate plan. It will not be easy for the Palestinians under those circumstances to walk away. And I think in circumstances of that sort, also given the relationship this president now has with Prime Minister Netanyahu, it would not be so easy for him to say no to him. So in the midst of all the uncertainty and the doom and gloom and the desire that I don't want people leaving here completely depressed, the fact is there is something there that could work out with the right kind of diplomatic effort.
And I think at the end, there's a recognition that it's got to be fair and just. It's not going to be everything that either party wants. But if you don't build a sense of fairness and justice in the final solution, this is only laying the groundwork for conflict in the future. Like I said, it's got to work in a sense that people say, look, I didn't get everything I wanted, but this is something I can live with. If it's something that they feel that, this was forced upon me, I don't agree with it, etc., that's going to only lead the seed to further conflict. So I think at the end of the day, I think that's what we'd all like to see, is a just peace. And I think the United States can play an important role in that.
I want to mine a point that we touched on earlier, which is sort of the difference between today and a decade ago, which is the role of the Arab world in a settlement. Prince Feisal, what role do you think the Egyptians are playing and can play in the process?
I think they have an important role to play, in particular as their proximity and their support in Gaza, which is under Palestinian Authority. Maybe because of the Arab Spring, they hadn't been playing as strong and as an effective a role as they had in the past. But I think they want to, and they should play. They are the biggest Arab nation, and they have a long history in trying to find solution. And I think you will find that they will play a positive role, and they're ready to do that. But like everything, all of us are waiting to see what this plan will be before we can pass judgment. And I think if it is a workable plan, if it's a plan that can be achievable, then everybody will go behind it, because this has gone on for too long. And all of us want to see peace in the region. All of us want to see an end to this conflict and this bloodshed. And not a single Palestinian or Israeli should die today or tomorrow because we're just unable to find a solution. We have to work for it. And I think Egypt has a strong role that it can play, and it can play a positive role. And I'm sure once we see what that plan is, that if it's something that can be achievable, it's workable, then I'm sure they will support it.
Ambassador Ross, what role do you think Egypt can play? Is it a supporting role in the process?
It is a supporting role. Look, Egypt's connection to Gaza and its ability to potentially influence that becomes critical. One of the problems we have today is even if we have a plan that could be accepted, it's not clear that it could be implemented in Gaza. I mean, the fact is we have Hamas in control of Gaza. Even though they now admit that they can't govern Gaza and want the PA back, they don't want to surrender their weaponry. Abu Mazen doesn't want to come back and assume responsibility without actually having control over the weaponry. Cracking that nut is going to be very hard. And so we have to recognize the difficulties. We also have to look at, all right, who can play a role trying to affect that? Egypt clearly can play a role in that regard. clearly also, if you had a coalescence of broad Arab support, Arab state support for what was seen as a legitimate plan to address the Palestinian national aspirations, and Hamas was the impediment to that, now you could bring an awful lot of pressure to bear. But here again, you have to deal with the whole security environment of the region as well. The Iranians, notwithstanding the fact that they said they support, the OIC and the Arab Peace Initiative, I doubt seriously that they will. My experience when we were negotiating in the 1990s, when we came, the only time we truly came close, the fact is, every time we came close, we'd get a bombing, and we discovered typically it was the Iranians fomenting and offering incentives to Hamas and Islamic Jihad to go carry out bombing. So, how we contain the Iranians in the region is also a fundamental part of also how you try to make peace here. So there's a lot of these issues fit together. When we talk about Syria, right now Iran continues to expand its presence in Syria. And again, if you're trying to create an environment that makes it more likely for Israelis and Palestinians to make peace, the more we can show we have a strategy, not just in words, but in actions to contain the Iranians there, the more it helps you in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the more confidence it builds among some of the Arabs, especially in the Gulf, who view the Iranians as basically their most existential threat. So here's where you have to have a strategy that has multiple elements to it.
On Iran, with the new appointment of Director Pompeo to be Secretary of State, it seems a foregone conclusion that the United States will pull back from the Iran deal, the JCPOA. Ambassador Ross, to you first, what are your perspectives on that policy strategy?
Well, I would be concerned if that's what the administration does. Not because I think the JCPOA was such a great deal, because I think it does, one of the problems it has is that in 2030, it basically legitimizes Iran as a country that can have a very large nuclear infrastructure, which creates the potential to move very quickly from being a threshold nuclear state to a weapon state. What it did do is it bought us time until then. Now the problem is, if the U.S. walks away in May, the U.S. walks away alone. The British, the French, and the Germans, who were part of the 5+1, meaning also China and Russia, they will not walk away with us. And they will go to great lengths at that point to try to convince the Iranians that they shouldn't walk away for fear that Iran will then relaunch its nuclear program, put themselves in a position where within a short period of time, instead of 2030, they become a nuclear threshold state. And the Europeans will go to great lengths to try to ensure that the Iranians won't do that, and the Iranians will play on their fears so that they will. So my fear is that we'll end up with the worst of all worlds. We'll walk away from the deal alone, and the Europeans, feeling the need to embrace the Iranians so they don't walk away, will also not be responsive to us in terms of what needs to be done in the region to counter the Iranians, which is where I think the most immediate threat is. We've bought time on the nuclear issue, which doesn't mean you ignore it. But the more immediate problem is what's happening in the region. And if the Iranians continue to expand, we're going to see more conflicts in this region. We're not going to see fewer conflicts.
Feisal, if the United States were to pull out of the JCPOA, would it have a ripple effect for Jordan?
We're not as directly linked or involved in the process. I think there are some legitimate concerns on both sides. I've heard discussions and arguments for and against the deal. I do know in talking with people that are involved on the nuclear with the International Atomic Agency, believe a deal at least gives them some transparency of what Iran is doing, and the failure of a deal would mean that they would lose any transparency because there's no reason for Iran to cooperate with them. At the end of the day, this is your sovereign decision, but I'll say for me, in personal, all my views I've been expressing are my own personal takes. It's not government policy as such. We don't have the transparency of the information to be able to make that judgment. What the president sees in terms of the reports and so on, he will make a judgment based on that. And I think without knowing what he is seeing, it's very difficult for people to second guess. I'm not sure it would be useful. And I think some transparency is, a friend of mine from the Atomic Agency, is better than no transparency. But at the end of the day, the United States has to decide whether this is something they're willing to go forward with, they're going to look to endorse it. Or is there room to renegotiate? And I can't answer that.
Can I just add one
Please.
point? What is happening right now is the administration is in negotiations with the British, French, and the Germans. And they're focused on what they see as some of the vulnerabilities of the deal. And these are legitimate issues to be raised, which the Europeans are acknowledging are legitimate issues to be raised. For example, the sunset provisions. What that means is the limitations on enrichment are lifted in the year 2030. And rather than having them lifted, one would like to see them go on for a good deal longer, if not in perpetuity. Secondly, there's ballistic missile testing, which was not covered by the JCPOA, which is a delivery vehicle for nuclear weapons. Thirdly, there's been the question raised about access to military bases within Iran. Now, this one is a little bit more problematic because the deal permits us to have access to any undeclared site that we have suspicions about. And the administration actually hasn't been bringing those suspicions to the table. So, in a sense, they're not testing that one, but that's also part of the discussions. The last area relates to Iran's behavior in the region. Now, the Europeans desperately want the U.S. to stay in the agreement. Here, the president is right to understand that desperation creates leverage for us to at least get the Europeans to agree to some of these things. Now, if you ask me, will they agree to all of them? No, they will not. But can we get an agreement from them on some of them? Yes, I think we probably can. And the real question is going to be, will that be good enough for the president?
We've had the opportunity to talk amongst ourselves about Iran's territorial ambitions, what's called the Shiite Crescent. Prince Feisal, I think many people in the audience are not familiar with the Shiite Crescent. Can you perhaps explain to them what it is and what the security and military implications are for your country?
I think when you look, His Majesty mentioned this over 10 years ago and came under a lot of criticism for saying it. And that is Iran's influence extending through Iraq, into Syria, into Lebanon with Hezbollah. And also the concern was that it would actually go in looking at Yemen, which wasn't the problem it was, but also looking at Somalia and coming in from the Horn of Africa, and thereby almost creating or encircling some of the traditional or historically predominantly Sunni states. We're not, when we look at Iran, they're not so directly involved. They tend to work through proxies. But you also have a region within the Middle East that feel very much that they are not comfortable and welcome Iran's ambition. And I don't think, I wouldn't say territorial ambition is what they have. When you look at Iran has historically, and it's not an Arab issue, it's not a Sunni Shiite, because Sunnis and Shiites historically have been able to live together in a peaceful environment and where religion really wasn't an issue. If you politicize religion, then it becomes an issue. And we look at Northern Ireland in the 70s, look at Northern Ireland now. If you take the politics out of the religion, people get along. But it is a traditional and a longer historical issue, which is Persian influence. And they consider themselves to be the regional superpower. And therefore, quite often they feel that, that we should respect their opinions and their decisions. And I think as any neighbor, you have your right to your opinion, I have the right to my opinion, but that doesn't mean that I've got to do everything that you say. And I think it's more of looking at the extension of that influence that concerns people within the region. I'm not sure I would say territorial ambition, because I don't see Iran wanting to expand beyond its borders. Does it want to have an influence? Does it want to does it want to have an influence? Does it want to have an ability to affect countries in a way that is sympathetic to their views? Yeah, I think we all have seen that. But there are people saying we want Iran out. It's not a question. The reality is that Iranian influence is there. The question is that how effective is that influence going to be? And rather than look and eliminate Iranian influence, we should look at how do we moderate it? How do we minimize their ability to manipulate things on the ground? And I think that's a far more achievable objective. But Iran, I don't think, is militarily looking to threaten the region. But it does so without, they prefer the indirect rather than the direct approach.
Ambassador Ross, on that count, what role can Saudi Arabia play at this time? Because it's a country that's really undergoing a tremendous revolution right now, but a revolution that is from the top down.
Look, I think that one could look at the Saudis from a couple of different perspectives. One, as a large Arab country, if you look historically, there's never been a successful model of development, of modernization with large Arab countries. It's one of the reasons that you've seen the radical nationalists, secular nationalists like Nasser or Saddam Hussein claim that they would produce the successful model. You then saw the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, Daesh, they claim they have the answer. What Saudi Arabia is trying to carry off right now is a national transformation. It is a revolution from above. It's not just an economic revolution, it's a social revolution. And the potential of the success is something that it means it could become a symbol for others in the region to think this is how we make progress. So having the Saudis succeed internally is huge. And we shouldn't underestimate it. And again, it's one of those areas where there's a potential that's quite positive. Now, the role they can play also in the region in terms of countering or containing the Iranians is also something that's worth thinking about. I mean, we tend to agree on most things. I would take a slight difference in one area with you on the Iranians. I agree with you that they like to do things through indirection, because the truth is they don't like to take casualties. They don't mind fighting to the last of the Shia militias. That's okay. They have brought Shia militias from as far away as Afghanistan and Pakistan into Syria. They have positioned themselves, now I've seen it myself, 3.5 miles from the Israeli border. That's not there for defensive purposes. So they're using these Shia militias as proxies as a way of gaining leverage over regimes. And so some of that is clearly to be able to project power. Some of it is simply to put themselves in a position where they can offer mafia types of options. If you don't want your garage to blow up, you're going to have to agree to us. So this is, in a sense, what they're doing. And to be fair, I do agree with you that they feel they're entitled to it. They feel they're this ancient civilization, and they have a right to dominate the region. And this is what they're pursuing. Now, there is something interesting going on within Iran right now. The Quds Force, the Revolutionary Guard, see the way to sustain the regime by constantly expanding. I think Rouhani and others who are more pragmatic actually feel maybe it makes more sense to try to reduce isolation and normalize. And we've seen that among the Iranian public, there's an interesting loss of fear. When you have unrest in 80 different cities, when that's put down by putting 5,000 people in jail, 25 people commit suicide in jail, and within 2 weeks you have women protesting about having to wear the hijab, it says something interesting is happening within Iran. And here's again where the Saudi example is kind of interesting. Those protests on the hijab followed the Saudi announcement that women could go and watch soccer, which, by the way, in Iran you can't. And this image within Iran that, you mean the Saudis, of all countries, Saudi women can go and do that and we can't? It plays on, in a sense, the dissonance there. So there can be a strategy here that also recognizes we need to think about power not only in hard military terms, but soft terms as well. The power of attraction, the power of a model, the power of creating hope, your point. You know, it's fear and the lack of hope that creates a kind of engine for every one of the extremist groups that we've seen within the Middle East. The antidote to them is showing, no, there's a pathway. And you don't have to resort to violence. You know, just to give you one other interesting example, there's a Palestinian city called Rawabi that has been built in the West Bank. It's not far from Ramallah. It is designed to be a kind of all-encompassing place. Right now, it's already the second largest employer for Palestinians compared to the Palestinian Authority. 4,000 people have moved in there. They have an amphitheater that holds 15,000 people. They hosted the Arab Idol winner, and 20,000 people came. One of the managers of this place was showing me around, and he said, our aim is to turn this into such a successful model that Palestinians will think in terms of they want a reason to live, not live to die. Well, you know, we're here for the cell. It's talking about, you know, how we contend with terror. How do you defeat the ideology of terror? You create a sense where people have a reason to want to live, not live to die.
I mean, I would like to, you know, I think, support it. People only look at suicide if there's no hope, if there's no other alternative. They see that there's no light. You know, nobody who thinks that he has a bright future and a promising future is going to commit suicide. You know, it's against human nature. And I think, as the ambassador said, if we can create that sense of hope, if we can create the sense that there's an optimism, that the future is going to get better, whether we're looking at the Arab-Israeli issue, whether we're looking in Syria or further afield, it's that sense of hope, that sense of that things are tough, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. That's what will sustain us, and that's what will defeat these extremists. They love fear, they love frustration, they love all of this confusion and anger that's being created, because that gives them raw recruits. And the only way we can deal with that, and you know, when we're looking at counterterrorism, I mean, there is always the sharp end, and I think a lot of people are focused on that, and that is a good way. There is also the socioeconomic side of it, which is the question of inclusion and people feeling that they actually belong to something bigger than themselves, and that they believe they're part of their own communities. And I think this is something in the United States, embracing, for instance, the Muslim community is going to be far more productive than isolating them. That's exactly what the extremists want. They want recruits saying, you know, you're not welcome in your own country. You know, come fight with us. And the third element, and this is something that as a Hashemite and as a Muslim we need to do, and that's to regain the, shall we say, the basics, the fundamentals of our religion, and take it away from these people. Because all of our religion, and I think all the religions of, you know, people here, Whether you're Jewish, whether you're Christian, you're Muslim, there's an underlying principle. Love God, love thy neighbor. And that's, all of us have that. And that's what we should be focusing on.
I was really moved earlier by your description of the refugees, both of you, that your nation is caring for. A really tremendous burden. 1 out of 6 or 7 Syrians is living in Jordan right now. What do you think is the most feasible course of action to find a resolution in Syria? What would be the initial step?
I think the initial step, and we're working, and we have been very successful with both working with the United States and with Russia, is focusing on southern Syria as an area to try and create a de-escalation zone to stop the fighting. It has resulted in no longer seeing any major moves of refugees entering the country. And when we're looking in terms of percentage, it is about 1 in 7 people in Jordan is Syrian, or comes from Syrian. So I think we need to try and stabilize the situation and then hopefully look at creating a political solution that people believe will succeed, and there are people that will want to go back. The challenge that we have is it's not going to be easy. The concern is that if we wave the magic wand tomorrow, the people say, well, the problem is resolved. Jordan has no refugee problem, not just us or Lebanon, or, they can all go back. The level of destruction in Syria is horrific. And so there are those that are going to be determined they want to go back and help rebuild, but you don't have electricity, you don't have water, you don't have communications, you don't have education, you don't have health. And if you've got a young family, would you, willing to expose them to that risk? Or shall we say, look, let's wait a little while, see how things are, if things are stable and so on, then we'll be encouraged to go back. So that's one of the factors, is that it's not when the war's over, everybody's going to rush back. The other aspect is it's been going on for, 7 years now. So you've got a generation of people that have actually grown up, and you visit Zaatari. Zaatari only represents about 12% of the refugees are actually in camps. The rest of them are distributed in the cities, in the rural areas, and etc. For anybody under the age of or 7, they know nothing else than Jordan, and being as a refugee. So they've probably established friends. They've established themselves. They're used to the way things are. A lot of them will have been enrolled into schools, etc. So even if a magic wand was waved tomorrow, there are a group of people who sit there and say, well, this is a foreign country. This is, yes, we've heard stories and so on, but they know nothing else. So just an immediate solution doesn't mean that the refugee problem is going to be solved. And I think a good portion of those will stay in Jordan because they've established roots. Their families have settled. They've got houses. Maybe their parents are now working, or they've got industry and so on. So I think if we solve the problem politically tomorrow, it's not going to be the end of the refugee, not just for Jordan, but when you're looking at Turkey and Lebanon, because first they want to make sure that it is safe enough to return, and then 2, what do they have? Is it going to be something that they can actually build a future on? And without medicine, without education, without electricity, without fuel, without communications, do you really want to drag your kids and everybody into that type of environment where you have access to that outside?
Ambassador Ross, do you think the current and previous administration have accepted or did accept that the old map is gone for Syria? It's not going back together. And what would you counsel the current administration about next steps?
I think from a public posture standpoint, neither administration has accepted that Syria can't be put back together again. The stated purpose is a unified Syria. The practical policies have not lent themselves to that, but I think part of that has been that both administrations, the Obama administration and the Trump administration, basically followed a policy more of avoidance than anything else. To the extent to which we've been involved, it had only to do with ISIS. And there were efforts, to be fair, there were efforts made going back to 2010 and with Secretary Clinton, reaching a set of principles with Foreign Minister Lavrov, then Secretary Kerry in November of 2015 with the Vienna Principles, and those were embodied in a Security Council Resolution 2254, which basically called for a real political process, that cessation of hostilities, complete, unencumbered, uninhibited provision of humanitarian assistance. There were sieges on 18 different cities and towns, and they were supposed to provide for absolute, unlimited provision of humanitarian assistance. There was supposed to be a new constitution drafted within 6 months and an 18-month political transition process. The Russians have lived up to none of these. And if you're going to have a political process, what I would advise the administration is Vladimir Putin has to understand that there's a price, that reaching agreements with us that you then don't fulfill and constantly backing Assad. Look, we had a Security Council resolution 2 weeks ago saying a 30-day ceasefire, and we're watching what is an absolute catastrophe right now. By the way, in 2 areas that are supposedly de-escalation zones. The Russians are permitting it to happen. The fact of the matter is, if Vladimir Putin says to Assad, you don't fly your planes, Assad can't fly his planes. You don't fly you don't drop the barrel bombs out of helicopters, they don't do that. That's not what they're saying to him. They're letting him expand, and by the way, they have embedded Iranian power as well. So I think the key is us going to the Russians and saying the following. We understand there can only be a political settlement here. We understand this isn't going to happen unless the two of us agree. Now, the problem is up until now we've agreed, but only one side lives up to what we agreed to. We're still prepared to do an agreement with you and to fulfill it. But if you're not prepared to fulfill your side of it, you need to understand that we will begin to act to limit what the Assad regime does. The fact of the matter is the Russians came in with a very small amount of air power, which they have used in an unlimited way, hitting hospitals, schools, bakeries, markets. We have dramatically more air power than they do. And we would say to them, if you don't stop them from doing what they're doing, we will. Think about the fact that President Obama didn't fulfill the red line. A year ago, when sarin gas was used by the Assad regime, we carried out a one-time strike, as it turned out, a one-off. The Russians at the time said, that's it, no more coordination with the Americans. That lasted 2 days, and then they were coordinating with us. So I think if we want to produce a political settlement, we have to be clear we're serious about it, but the Russians have to be too, and if the Russians don't fulfill their side of it, we are going to act. Bear in mind one thing about Putin. He wants to be seen as the arbiter of events. The last thing he wants is for the U.S. to use power and to be seen as if we're the ones now shaping it. If he knows this is what we're going to do, not just say it. He's not going to be convinced because we say it. He's going to have to see some manifestation if he doesn't fulfill what he's doing. That at least could put us on a track to producing a political outcome. You're completely right. A political outcome by itself doesn't bring the refugees back. The estimates are $300 billion to do reconstruction in Syria. And you can't expect refugees to go back if they're going back to a place where there's nothing for them. And they don't have a whole lot of confidence in the regime that's there. So a couple things have to happen for them to go back. First, they have to see there actually is a real political process, and there is a sharing of power. I believe the future of Syria will not be necessarily divided up, but I think it will be largely a federal kind of arrangement, a lot of decentralization. So they have to see there's a real political process, and then they have to see there's a real construction going on. And they have to hear from people within Syria. When I went to the Zaatari camp, one of the things I was struck by, when I talked to people there, they wanted to be able to return. But they said very plainly, as if they had just, as if you had just been speaking to them, what do we go back to?
Prince Feisal, what role do you think Russia can play in a positive way? Is it setting itself up as a power broker or an arbiter in the region?
I think if you look at it back historically, I mean, Russia has always had a traditional role. I think when you look at what is going on in Syria, I think the Russians are pragmatic. They want to find a solution, but they also want to protect their interests, which is understandable. I think there's nothing that the president would like better than to be able to be part of finding a solution and to, play that role as that, well, none of this would have happened without us, and we're contributing positively internationally. And I think we can look, I think, rather than some approach them as being spoilers, no, I think they can be put productively, but obviously their perspective is if they need a face-saving way out. It's not something that is very cheap for them. It is costing them. It is costing them politically as well. But the reality is they're on the ground, so they can influence it. And I think anybody who sits there and believes that they have no role and shouldn't have a role is not thinking clearly. Let's understand that they're there. Whether people agreed or not, they committed themselves into the Syrian conflict. But I think they can play a positive role, and I think we should be working with them to try and engage them and encourage them to play that role. And so I don't see them as being a problem. They should be part of the solution. I think they can be part of the solution.
I'm very sad to report that our time has almost run out. But before we conclude this evening, I'd like you to address the special relationship that the country of Jordan has with the state of Colorado.
As I said before, the relationship formally as part of the state partnership is 14 years old, but the relationship goes back even before that. And some of the people that were instrumental in that partnership are in the audience. It really has been key, and even when I go talk to the Pentagon, sometimes they underestimate the strength of that relationship. The state partnership has allowed us to be far more responsive, to work more integrated. We've built relationships, we've built family, we've, brothers and sisters that have worked side by side, and I think that should not be underestimated. And it is something that provides far greater flexibility. It has traditionally been a military to military. We're looking to expand that to more in terms of civil to civil. Interestingly enough, although geographically we're very different, we face similar challenges, whether it's looking at water shortages, whether looking at some of the issues in protecting environment. I had the opportunity to go to the National Renewable Energy Lab today and see some of the things that they're working on. There's a lot we can do. And I think it starts off with that friendship. It starts off with that partnership. And there's so much more that we can do together and look at opportunities. And it's not just building relationships with dear and close friends. It's actually We've served in deployments together side by side. It is a wonderful relationship. It's something I'm very proud to have been part of. I know that the governor has given his full support, and you've got great guards people. You have, both police and your, fire and your emergency rescues. So many people have built that relationship. And Colorado might figuratively be small, but so are we. But it's the strength of knowing each other that builds that confidence, that builds that understanding, so that if we have to work together, if we have to serve side by side, it's not a stranger. You only have that 1 or maybe 2 degrees of freedom in terms of knowing somebody common. And it makes the relationship absolutely fantastic. And I couldn't ask for better partners in Colorado here.
Prince Feisal and Ambassador Ross, I would like to sincerely thank you for the opportunity to be the moderator today, for such an honest and candid, and from my point of view, I learned so much from you this evening about what is a very complicated set of problems, but you were able to simplify it, and I'm really grateful for that. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming this evening and for giving me the opportunity to be your moderator, and thank you for being so engaged in the nation's security and also the future and a future of hope for the Middle East. And I'd like to invite Larry back for some closing remarks. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our fabulous panelists. One of the most insightful programs we've ever done. I want to thank you individually and collectively for being here and participating. I'd like to thank all of you that support the event. I'd like to remind all of you that on Wednesday, May 23rd is the dinner. Those that have forgotten, I wanted to remind you. And most important, God bless you. God bless America. Good night.